And there are three parts of ownership. The first is that acknowledgement piece. This is where we apologize. We acknowledge that we've hurt people, or we acknowledge the reality of the choices that we made. The second part of it is, and then we create a plan to change. And then the third part is we implement that plan. And one of the things that we run into a lot are men that will acknowledge that they've done something hurtful, and yet they don't follow that through to create a plan to change and then actually plan. And for those of you that might be in relationship with a man where it's kind of like he's a serial apologizer, but there really doesn't seem to be any change, that can be incredibly frustrating.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. I'm Randy Evert, your co-host, and as usual, we have our host, Dr. Greg Miller here. Greg, how are you?
I'm doing well. I feel like I'm a ways over. I'm going to scoot over.
All right, come on over.
I feel excluded.
Sure.
One of my desires is to be included.
Well, and I showered today, so you're safe. Today again, we by popular demand, we've had so many people write and call and email us, when is Jim Farmer going to come back on the podcast? So today we pooled our resources and paid a little extra, and here he is.
Yeah. Thanks,
Jim.
Randy.
Jim, it's great to see you as always.
I think I'd just like to come on the show because I get all that affirmation from you right away.
Well, we're here to affirm.
That's right. Another one of our desires.
It is. We're thinking of coming up with an eighth desire, but we haven't come up with whatever it is now. But Jim, it's great to have you with us today.
Glad to be here.
Good. And so today we are going to talk about
the idea of what are some of the barriers that men may encounter to really owning their addiction. And to start with, I just want to, if you've been listening to the podcast, you probably heard me talk about this before, but kind of what ownership is. And there are three parts of ownership. The first is that acknowledgement piece. This is where we apologize. We acknowledge that we've hurt people, or we acknowledge the reality of the choices that we made. The second part of it is, and then we create a plan to change. And then the third part is we implement that plan. And one of the things that we run into a lot are men that will acknowledge that they've done something hurtful, and yet they don't follow that through to create a plan to change and then actually plan. And for those of you that might be in relationship with a man where it's kind of like he's a serial apologizer, but there really doesn't seem to be any change, that can be incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this, Greg. I know we've had a lot of questions about this in particular, and so I think that's why we kind of brought that up in staff meeting earlier on Monday. So
we're going to start with what we see as 4 barriers that men have to really owning what they've done. And then we're going to spend some time talking about a 5th that I also think that you brought up that I think is important. So I think the first thing that keeps people from really owning something is when they deny it. And they're just not acknowledging that something happened. And we can see this in men where they are denying the choices that they've made, the actions, the way they've acted out. And for some men, even in the face of some evidence, they still are denying that that is their email, or that was their history on the computer. And so the first thing that keeps us from owning something is when we just deny that it happened.
Yeah, I think that's exactly true. And one of the things we got to remember is sometimes that denial is a conscious decision, other times it's not. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes this strategy is often learned long before the addictive behavior or compulsive behaviors in place.
Right.
I often talk about an experience once where, I had a client one time that was significantly physically abused by his father, but in his mind, it was one of these things, I just don't think that happened.
Right.
I was told that was happened, but I don't think that happened.
Right.
But there was ample evidence that it actually had happened.
Yeah.
In terms of wounds on his body.
Right. I also think one thing that we can see with men is that there's certain parts of their acting out that they will own, but then there are other things in their acting out that they deny. And one of the things that we want men to understand is it's not just about taking responsibility for part or some of your choices, but if we're really going to be free, we've got to be willing to own everything. And we often joke, there's this idea of that last 10% or 15%.
What is it going to be this month?
Yeah. It's that percentage that we are afraid is just too much. And I often hear men talk about this, that, when they're doing a full disclosure with their wives, they have this sense that she can handle this 85 or 90% of it, but this last detail is too much. And there is a temptation not to bring that out. But what we know is the consequence of not being completely open really is significant. So the first thing is just denial. And some of that can be denial of what they've done, or it can be a denial of part of what they've done. Another strategy that I think keeps people from really owning their addiction and their choices is when they're minimizing. And that's where they acknowledge that they did something, but they may not be willing to look at the significance or the fullness of it, and they're telling themselves it's really not that bad or it's not that big of a deal.
Sometimes I see this like when we do a full disclosure, for instance, if a guy hasn't been recovered for too long, he might put something in the disclosure like, we kissed but we didn't have sex. Or, I just talked to her.
Right. Or even minimizing the type of the relationship. We would text, but we were just friends. There was nothing more, and not really owning this additional energy, especially in an emotional affair, that they were bringing to the text exchange. So that's a great example of minimizing. I admit that I did something, but I'm not taking full responsibility for it.
That's right. Or one of the other ones I hear, well, I wasn't as bad as that guy.
Right. Yeah. And we often talk about it, that one of the principles of recovery is don't compare, identify. And as soon as I'm in that I'm not as bad as that guy or I'm worse than everybody else, that actually keeps us from owning something. And so, if there's a pendulum, on one end of the pendulum is minimizing, and that's not fully taking responsibility for it. But the other end of the pendulum is catastrophizing. And if I'm catastrophizing it, if I'm making it too big, then what's happening is that shame is keeping me from owning it again. The ownership begins with truth. And so if I'm minimizing it or catastrophizing it, I'm not really living in the truth of it.
Yeah. I think that one of the other ways this plays out, at least in some of the work that we do here, is sometimes the minimization will go into the wife's pain. Like, at least I didn't do this. I don't know why you're so hurt. I just looked at pornography. I didn't have sex with her.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and even another way that minimizing can show up is when there's a judgment that the wife is still hurting. Like, are we still talking about this? Have you not gotten over it yet? Again, those messages, either spoken or unspoken, because we can certainly non-verbally communicate in our sighs and our huffs and those types of things. That's another way that we are minimizing. We can minimize what we've done, and we can also minimize the impact it has on other people. The third thing that keeps us from really owning something is when we rationalize it. And the way I define rationalization, that is when we use some sort of distorted logic to explain what we've done. And it's kind of the goal of it is to be able to say, well, it makes sense to me, so by me explaining it this way, it should make sense to you.
Yeah. I mean, and sometimes that can mess with your sense of reality if you're on the listening side of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like there's something there's something wrong with you. But there's like a rationalization. Sometimes we'll hear guys say, well, I wasn't expecting it. She started talking to me, and before I know it, we're having this conversation. So it's this rationalization that, I wasn't responsible for this. She started it.
Right. Well, and even I was on a business trip and I just had a bad meeting, and, my boss was angry with me. And so I started this conversation, or she started. It's trying to explain a behavior that really has no explanation. And I do think that, AA talks about stinking thinking. And this is absolutely an example of that. When we are rationalizing our choices and our behaviors, trying to explain them to somebody else, trying to make them logical, we really are in addiction thinking. We're in stinking thinking.
Yeah, and sometimes it sounds really good, actually. I think that's the hard part of it. If you're on the spouse side of this, sometimes it actually sounds really good, and you almost can convince yourself as a spouse,
right?
It seems like that's a good reason, but that's not very helpful for the person. That's
right. Well, because again, as long as I'm rationalizing it, I'm not taking responsibility for it. Yeah. The fourth way that typically we can not really own is when we justify. And justification is about entitlement. And the message of entitlement is, I deserve to do this. And one of the things that we teach at the workshop is that in order for there to be justification, there has to be some sort of core belief that supports the conclusion that I deserve it.
Mm-hmm.
And an example I would use, for those people who have a core belief that life is supposed to be fair.
Mm-hmm.
Not everybody has that core belief, some people do. And so if I have the core belief that life is supposed to be fair, and my perspective is life isn't fair, then I can use that, well, my life isn't fair, therefore I deserve to act out in this way.
Mm-hmm.
Or if I have core beliefs about marriage or sexuality, that my wife is supposed to always be available to me, and then she's not available to me, well, I deserve to look at porn because she's not making herself available. So that it's a way to feel entitled as if I deserve what it is that I'm doing.
Yeah. One of the terms I often use with guys to help them to kind of understand this one is, what is the permission statement that you give yourself before you act out, or before you engage porn, or before you do that thing that you don't want to do? What do you say to yourself that gives you permission? And I believe, this is kind of where we're going to go with it next, Greg.
Right.
I think this one in particular is rooted on an inability to deal with things that grieve a person.
Right. So you're making a great segue. So the fifth thing, the thing that we want to spend some time talking about is when the addict starts believing or presenting himself as a victim. To be a victim keeps us from owning and taking responsibility for the things that really are our responsibility. And so what you've already kind of started it, but what are some of the ways that this sense of victimhood shows up for that person struggling with addiction?
Yeah, I think, at times it's when the spouse is hurting, they turn it back on themselves. Like, well, I had a hard day at work, or, you were short with me, so they end up kind of, the spouse is bringing up an issue. They were hurt by something, but then it's turned around and now, it's more about my hurt than the other person's hurt.
Right.
And I think a big part of that is, for that person, it often has to do with that it's these learned ways of dealing with their own victimhood that then at some point they turn the tables, if you will.
Right. Well, one of the things I believe is that a person can be victimized.
Mm-hmm.
And many of the men who come through our workshop had some sort of difficult, painful, horrific experience as a child where they were victimized. The difference is when I become a victim, I allow what happened to me to begin to define me. Mm-hmm. And anyone can be vulnerable to that.
Yeah.
If I'm allowing a circumstance or a situation or someone's reaction to become my identity, I'm now allowing myself to become a victim of that. Mm-hmm. And in that place of victimhood, whatever is my responsibility, whatever choices I can make, I'm surrendering those. And so we want to make that distinction that there are times when someone is victimized, mm-hmm. and what we want to resist is allowing what happened to me to become who I am. And in the case of the addict, there is this kind of helpless energy. I can't help myself. There's no other way to do it. Of course, what was I supposed to do? And when it really is a surrendering of power and agency to live differently. And maybe that's one of the ways to understand becoming a victim is I'm allowing this circumstance to define me and I'm surrendering my agency to something that happened in the past so that those things I can change, I'm not willing to invest the energy to change.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you're right on with that, Greg. It's this experience of powerlessness when, quite frankly, maybe they were helpless, mm-hmm. as a child to deal with whatever the powerlessness that was going on in their lives. But at some point it's recognizing, yeah, I am powerless over what happened to me, but I do have choices now.
Right. And there's a wisdom because there are things that happened in the past that are so formative that there are some choices that were taken away from us based upon that experience. Mm-hmm. And the wise adult is able to admit there are certain things that were taken from me because of those experiences, and yet there are certain things that I still have, I used the word earlier, agency, I have power, I have control, I can live differently going forward. And one of the things that we often say here is we don't deal with the past to blame the past. Mm-hmm. If I'm blaming the past, then I'm surrendering my responsibility to change the present and the future. So we deal with the past to understand the past so that we can be empowered to live differently in the future. But for the person who lives in that victim place, they're actually allowing themselves to be defined by the past, and they're blaming the past for where they are now.
Yeah, I think so. I when we think about, the victimhood, how did it impact us? What got altered for us, and then recognizing we can go and deal with those things. There's unfairness about, when we are victimized, that there is some unfairness about that. But the reality is we have to deal with whatever the consequences were as a result of that.
Right. And a lot of times, you alluded to this, but this idea that we become a victim when we want, consciously or unconsciously, to avoid the pain and the grief that is necessary in order for there to be healing. If I just kind of surrender to this circumstance, then I don't have to deal with the reality of it, which means it's going to keep me from moving towards the pain. And again, the idea is I move towards, I move through, I move beyond. I want to get on the other side of this to the extent that I can. But if I'm allowing myself to be defined by the pain, I stay stuck in that pain. I stay stuck in my powerlessness.
Yeah, and that's the part of the work that kind of gets heavy in recovery, is identifying and developing some awareness of what happened for a person, and then kind of going after the things that we're needing to recover through a process. I always kind of give this example. I had this pastor that I've worked with years ago, and when he was a kid, he was sexually abused, and the guy has great leadership skills. He's a very influential guy. Well, one of the things that he was struggling with was, if he, was around vulnerable people, it would kind of trigger his experience of being actually sexually abused by a pastor himself. But this guy is very influential. You can see that he had the giftedness of influence and power. And I said, wow, I think you got introduced to this idea that power is for the person who's kind of in charge or has authority over you. And so, whatever happens in the interaction is for that person who's ever in power. But I don't think that's a healthy perspective on power. I think, people who are in power or have influence, they use that for the benefit of others rather than for their own benefit. And I was encouraging them, that's a way to recover that from that experience, is to use this giftedness you have for influence, but to direct it towards the benefit of others rather than getting something taken away from you.
Right. Well, and again, you're kind of alluding to this idea for those people who experienced an abusive situation growing up. There's this idea of remixing, where they take the components of the previous experience and they try to put them in a new way. They put them together in a new way where they are the one with voice, or they are the one that has power. Whatever was taken away from them from the abusive experience or the place where they were victimized, they're now trying to put it back together where they are trying to meet the needs that were lost, or the things that were lost in the earlier experience. And it is that conversation, it is that awareness, it is wise adults challenging us so that we can see more clearly that makes it possible for us to move on. And we've been talking about what keeps us from really owning something. Well, ownership starts with truth. I've got to be in the truth. And it's about right sizing. I'm not going to minimize it. I'm not going to catastrophize it. I'm not going to rationalize it. I'm not going to justify it. What's also true, though, is what keeps us from being in truth is either blame or shame. And when we become a victim, what we end up doing is living in that blame space where it's never our responsibility. It's not our fault. I often talk about many people surrender to what they believe is inevitable. My failure is inevitable. Me being hurt is inevitable. People leaving me is inevitable. But as soon as I have a core belief that something negative is inevitable, I begin to orient my life around that. And then I do become a victim to that core belief that my hurt, rejection, failure is inevitable. And so what we do is we take our agency to say, no, it is possible, it is possible I will be hurt. It is possible I may fail. It is possible I may be rejected. That is very different than believing those things are inevitable. So victim is kind of living in that place of blame, And some people, what they do is they try to get out of the blame by going into shame. And we often talk about if there's blame, there's shame. If there's shame, there's blame. But to understand, the opposite of victim or blame is not shame. The opposite of victim or blame is truth. Whatever is true is true. What did happen, however you were victimized, is true. And it's not the whole truth. And it doesn't have to define your future going forward.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think part of that, and I know you've talked about this before, Greg, that oftentimes we have to start to acknowledge some of the earlier truths before we start to acknowledge, some of these more current truths and deal with those feelings first, because that's where some of these coping mechanisms came or started.
What's interesting is, one of the most challenging things to do is to be in relationship with someone that is in their shame or in their blame. Because intuitively we know that they're not in their truth, and blame or shame keeps us from being able to fully own. And for a lot of men early in recovery, they can live in that shame space, which makes it difficult for a spouse to really be in relationship with them because they're not in that place of truth and wisdom. And so, for the spouses who are listening, they may be becoming aware that part of what makes it challenging for them to relate or interact with their spouse is a false attempt to own when we're in that blame or shame place. And so we may be acknowledging what happened, we may be acknowledging of what we did, but when we're in the blame place, we're not taking responsibility for it. And obviously to the people in our lives, if we're not owning it, we are not showing up in a safe way.
Yeah. I think that the relational part of it is where it really gets tough, because if you haven't dealt with these things that may have been, where you felt victimized, we tend to see others in relationship as maybe potential threats. And so we're seeing, each other from this up-down position rather than, hey, we're equals, owning our own things. It's always kind of you versus me.
Right.
And who's going to survive.
Right. I'd also say, a lot of the men who come through our workshop have never really dealt with these issues before. They've never really told their stories. They've not acknowledged their past. And we've all had those experiences where maybe for the first time in the small group here, a man is admitting some of the victimization that he experienced growing up. So it makes perfect sense. If you're early in this journey, you're kind of swinging back and forth between the blame and the shame, trying to find the balance of truth. And what I often encourage men to do is, when you're in that place of chaos, whether you're in blame that says, it's not my fault, it's somebody else's fault, or you're in shame, it's all my fault, I'm worthless, one of the things that helps us get grounded is truth. What is true about me? What is true about God? What is true about the situation? That grounding in truth then allows us to start moving towards ownership. And one of the principles I believe is I cannot change something that I don't own. Stewardship begins with ownership. So if I want to steward my past, I have to own my past. If I want to steward my future, I have to own that there is a future, that my failure isn't inevitable. Those are the things, that ownership, truth piece is what allows us to look at our past in a way where we're not defined by it, we are informed by it, and that being informed by it allows us to live differently going into the future.
I think so. And you're touching on this thing where, a lot of guys are, they made vows to themselves that they were never going to share something, or they're never going to tell something. And so oftentimes, that's kind of what they're up against when they're wanting to take ownership of something. They're fearing, what is the response that I'm going to get?
Right. Well, and I'll even take it to, there are those men, and what we're saying about men being victimized is also true, women are victimized. But in talking about the clients here at Faithful and True, is that a lot of those men not only made pledges to themselves that they would never tell anybody, they made a pledge to somebody else. If you were victimized in some sort of abusive context, what may be true is you made a pledge, maybe forcefully, but you made a commitment that you would never tell something that had happened, and you made that to somebody else, not just yourself, and breaking that creates all kinds of disorientation. But speaking the truth is what begins to set us free, which does allow us to own and get out of that victim place.
Yeah. That's why I love the workshop so much, because when guys share things for the first time, And I know it's going to happen this week when we have the men's workshop. It happens every month where, typically somebody will share something and they'll say, I've never shared this with anybody before.
Mm-hmm.
And what they receive from the other men is usually a lot of acceptance.
Right.
And it breaks through that fear that, people would reject me if they knew this about me.
Absolutely. One of the things that we're talking about is this sense of powerlessness. And so what we teach is that when we are in our addiction, we are powerless. However, when we are in our recovery, that is when we are powerful. And so if you're living your life feeling like you are a victim, like either something that you are aware of or something unacknowledged is holding you hostage, where you are living this small and limited life, where you don't feel like you have agency to make choices and feel empowered, it begins with that acknowledgement of, okay, what is my story? What is mine to own? And what's also true is there are sometimes things are given to us that are not ours. Yeah. And so the wise adult is able to look at a situation, and whatever is theirs, they're going to own. And whatever is theirs, whatever is not theirs, they're going to release. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times children are given things that are not theirs. Mm-hmm. And they're given responsibilities that are not there. They're given a task that is not suitable for them. We often talk about enmeshment, where maybe a son feels enmeshed with his mom and feels responsible for her emotional well-being, or it can happen with a dad too, where I feel like I have to take care of my dad and make sure that he's happy. Well, that was not your responsibility, but as a child you were given that, and all these years later you're carrying something that is not yours. Mm-hmm. And so part of this ownership is taking on the things that are yours, but also releasing the things that are not yours that you no longer have to carry.
Yeah, I think so. The other thing I want to kind of circle back to is this thought that we kind of introduced where, when we do this switch from, being a victim to a victimizer, what does that look like? And I think one of the things that some of the men that we work with, there's a sense of sympathy that they get, that if I'm the victim, then I don't have to deal with that. Mm-hmm. And so it's almost reinforcing,
right?
That I'm getting some positivity or attention. And so that becomes a coping mechanism itself. Now I'm the victim and I don't have to worry about how I hurt you.
Right, exactly. Well, and same way with shame.
Yeah.
When I'm in my shame and I'm in I'm a horrible guy, I'm worthless, those old shame messages, then our expectation is that others will come and comfort us and will tell us that, no, we're a great guy. And a lot of this is unconscious, but again, that shame keeps us stuck. And it is challenging when someone is in that victim place to respond to them in a wise way, because they're showing up with some of that survival strategy of being a victim.
Yeah. And it's not a bad thing to acknowledge the pain they've been through.
No, not at all.
Where it goes off the rails is, when that's my response to hearing someone else's pain.
Right, absolutely. And again, I use being a victim as my survival strategy or my coping strategy to avoid something that really needs some attention, and it will be difficult and painful and will take work. We see playing the victim card as being an easy pass that keeps us from having to deal with that. But the reality is, as all of our survival strategies, they come at a cost.
Mm-hmm.
Way to wrap it up, Greg. Well done. We were running out of time here on today's podcast, but we'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. We hope that this podcast is beneficial to you in all that we do here. We're trying to give direction, and we're getting just fantastic feedback from our listeners out there, and we really appreciate that they are affirming the efforts that we try to share with you here at Faithful and True. We'd like to also make you aware of our website, in case you've never visited, faithfulandtrue.com, where you'll find many resources. You'll find over 500 podcasts such as this one, and we also have all the information online about our 3-day intensive workshops. Greg made mention just a minute ago that we're about to have our November version of the Men's Journey workshop starting here tomorrow, and we've got 28 men from across the country coming to our center to participate in in the workshop experience. And that. Jim, we'd like to thank you for coming with us again today. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show and sharing your experience and knowledge and wisdom. Not so much on the wisdom, but you're always appreciated, and you know that. So anyway, we'd like to again say that this coming week will be a week that hopefully for you will be filled with many blessings and with great vision.